Hello, I am Alex Wood, and this is Strategy for Breakfast, the podcast all about real business challenges based on real business conversations. This week, we're delighted to welcome back a guest from Series 1, Mr. Glen Willoughby, who's joining us all the way from his home in New Zealand, giving up your evening to be with us to chat all about AI. And in particular, this week, we're going to be diving into the ethics of AI, drawing a line between what we can do with technology versus what we should do. So, as I say, Glen is returning to the pod, having featured in Series 1 when he was working for NASA. Well, now Glen is the Chief Digital Information Officer for Nilo Consulting and a Director for ISB, as well as a Senior Research Fellow at the Victoria University of Wellington and an Advising Fellow in IT Digital at NASA's Jet Population Laboratory. Lots of experience, lots of insight. But before we get started, a quick reminder to you, our listeners, to subscribe and to share. Let us know what you think of today's episode. Give us your feedback. Of course, we want you to get involved. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcast, and you can contact us in the comments or even email podcast@gdsgroup.com. So with all that out the way, Glen, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you here. How are you doing?
No, good. Thanks, Alex. And a pleasure to be here again. I was just trying to remember when I was last here. I think it was more than 6 months ago, and a lot of water's gone under the global bridge since that time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that was a lengthy intro that I gave you there. I hope all of that was accurate and up to date. Tell us what's changed, because you were, as I said, you were working with NASA previously. You are still doing that in some capacity, I understand. But tell us a
It's
little bit
a
about what.
smaller advisory role. Picked up since that time. Actually, before that time, the CIO of Singularity University at Silicon Valley. But my day job is around innovation, technologies, and implementing to solve global problems. It sounds grandiose, but it's like any other job, trying to apply technology that's going to work to solve a problem that's ahead of us.
Mm.
Application of solutions is really more my interest and experience.
Absolutely. Well, as I said, it's a pleasure to have you back on the podcast. And we've got you now for about 30 minutes. We're going to dive into this question of AI, and more particularly, as I said, the ethics of AI, really getting into an understanding, I suppose, of what we can do, what we're capable of doing with AI versus what we should do with AI. And what sort of prompted this really as a sort of conversation we've wanted to have was this review by Microsoft, which is underway at the moment. You may have seen it in the press in recent weeks. I think The Guardian was reporting just a couple of weeks ago. So Microsoft has launched this company-wide review, ethical review of its existing policies around AI, and in particular banning companies from using its technology to do things such as infer emotion, gender, or age using facial recognition. So I suppose really just as an opening gambit, an opening question for you is just what are your thoughts generally on the ethical application of AI, how it's being used to benefit us as a society, but also the limitations, who is setting barriers with where we can go with AI, seeing as so much of it is an unknown.
Well, thanks. Firstly, my congratulations to Microsoft. I think taking a leadership position as a supplier of technologies is to be commended. I know AWS thinking of similar work. So I think some of our major organizations, such as AWS, Microsoft, are taking very strong stewardship roles, and that's to be commended. Why do I say that? One of the challenges around ethics and stewardship coordination of ethics in the past with the technology has really been down to governments. Challenge with governments is they operate slowly, they enact through legislation, and we don't want governments that pass legislation fast and willy-nilly. We want stability. So we've got an interesting situation that may not quite have occurred in the history of humanity as AI is emerging. So if I look at presentations that I've been to or even made 5 years ago, AI wasn't well known. We were talking about AlphaGo was an amazing achievement with Google DeepMind. Only 5 to 6 years ago, where we are now, and only such a short space of time is staggering, the development and progress that's progressed.
Mm,
Um, there's still, I think, a sense by many people that AI is a technology discipline, and in my view, it really isn't. It is a discipline all of its own and in its own right. Different pressures, different issues, different considerations, and moving probably at a much faster pace than I've seen any other new invention or new tool.
mm,
So the ethical discussion, I think, A, is critically important now, but one that will just never end and needs to keep up with the pace of the technology development.
mm,
So if I look at a couple of challenges, I think some of the challenges as context is the term AI. It's now become a common English term. It means all sorts of things, and because very confusing and misleading. If we look back around the US election, in the way in which Facebook was used, if we look at Brexit, there was a lot of comments around the use of AI. That's sort of true. There was some smart algorithms, there was some smart social networking. But if we think of AI as an intelligent tool, partly a self learning tool that has an opportunity to train itself based on data sets that it is given, and then on an ongoing basis, experience and learnings that it has in its production operation, then it's a definition which is a learning system. And the ethics is a wide space. So it can include how you source the data to train it,
mm,
what you're training it to do, of the data you're sourcing and training it. What are the biases? What are the unintended consequences? So I think we're moving from what has been a spark of an invention to then create some interesting solutions and case studies as the technology sparks, to now in a position where it's not only used as a smart information tool, it's used as an intelligent design tool.
mm.
Not that long ago, I was in a forum talking about AI designed enzymes, the opportunities around DNA design
Wow.
with AI. Now, none of these things were talked about 2 years ago. They were interesting ideas. They were in a lab. They are rapidly moving into commonplace.
Mm.
So
Does that
the ethical considerations, I think, are A, critical, and B, I think we have to practically think about how do we create an ethical environment that is realistic.
mm,
And harking back to my earlier comment, I don't think we should just expect it from government or regulation. In
mm,
fact, that's the last place we should expect it. I think we've got a community, whether it's a vendor supplier community, and more important, a corporate responsibility for those organizations that are trying to solve problems that need some very robust thinking in the design component.
mm,
I think the days are well past where we have a good idea, let's rush to do something,
mm.
gain some experience. Usually, if you've got a good idea, usually if it has some tangible application, it creates value. Sometimes you then can't stop it.
Mm.
So,
But does
yeah,
that
2 years ago, I don't think we were thinking like this. Now, I think the conversation around ethics is starting to get quite mature in terms of the sorts of things we should start to think about, which lends itself to how do we enact it and who are the players that might help us on that journey.
I mean, yeah, you just made me think there. 2 years is not a huge amount of time, and yet the progress that has been made is huge. I mean, that can't be understated. As you said, we're doing things now we weren't even thinking about a few years ago, just a matter of months ago, in fact. So, does that not, as a specialist, does that not scare you a little bit? Is this not Is this not a frightening concept that we don't know where this can go? And therefore, the question of ethics, as you say, comes as a secondary matter in many ways because we just don't quite know where this is taking us.
Yeah, I'd like to probably frame the question differently. I think it creates amazing and exciting opportunities. We can solve problems that we could have never dreamed of solving before, and that's an amazing opportunity. Uh, One of the things that doesn't move fast is human adoption and human behavior. AI is moving rapidly. Human adoption, human behavior is relatively consistent, pretty relatively easy to predict. So if I reshape the discussion to look at um, the ethical application of AI in the context of human behavior and human adoption, is the best way I can think about it and get my head around it. So, if I give you an example, it's an example I'm currently working in. We've just kicked off international research project around breast cancer detection. Not new as an AI problem to solve. Many organizations have done this before. We have an amazing data set that is one of the largest training data sets in the globe. And that's something we're thinking about in terms of how we apply that. Now, the problem we're trying to solve, though, is not just to run a research project. It takes 14 years to train a breast screening radiologist. The workforce is under serious distress. COVID has created a big backlog for all OECD countries running screening programs. So we have a workforce in fairly dire condition, and therefore we will have cancers going undetected to the detriment of the health of women. So that problem is a compelling problem to solve. It's a problem we need to solve now. And if we look at then how do we solve it? Well, one of the things I think with any technology, AI or otherwise, is people and organizations must move at a pace that they can adapt to. So I think we run into ethical problems when we're trying to solve a problem that's way beyond the capability of the organization to embrace. And each organization is different. I think it's when we overscope what we're trying to achieve that we create too many unintended consequences and potential for failure. This is into the cancer identification. It's a sensitive topic. The data we're dealing is very sensitive. The problem is very critical to solve. But from a technical standpoint, it's not a really difficult problem to solve. It's an image detection problem. The good thing about that problem is it shouldn't have large technical complexity. And like any adoption of a new way of working, or particularly adoption with AI, I think the first step for many organizations is solve something simple, technically simple, and solve something that has a absolute imperative that it must be solved. So you've got a reason to progress, reason to invest, and a reason to put time. And if you start there, something reasonably simple, low complexity, solves a compelling problem, you start to gain experience and you start to get a track record of success, but also you start learning how do you apply these tools in a measured way. So I look at the ethics question partly around the positive and negative opportunities AI can provide. I sort of akin it to nuclear power. You can do amazing things with nuclear power. There's 2 rovers on Mars that are nuclear powered. Without it, we couldn't do the science exploration on Mars. There's obviously nuclear energy, but as we know, there's some really bad things that can be done with nuclear energy, and AI is no different. It's a tool that you can do amazing things with, or some particularly bad things with, just like any other technology. So I reframe the question around ethics more around change management and adoption in an organization. So that you're scoping something that will have a high chance of success, not overreaching, but creates experience and capability. Um, I think our challenges become when we're solving a problem that we don't have a strong history or background to solve. Once we do the first project with AI in a typical organization, you've got a good success, you then get enough social license and enthusiasm to do the next one and take the next jump and then the next jump. So my question around ethics and trying to solve that is no different to the basic practices around change management.
Yeah. Yeah.
When we're too far beyond our experience and known history, then we start to lose control around what we're doing. So that's sort of one approach around ethics. The second approach is, I think, really around learning and sharing. There are many organizations doing great things. We're all relatively new with AI, no matter how much experience we have in it. And the lessons learned and trying to preempt what problems might be occurring, I think, is the next step around understanding how to approach ethical management. And you can't do it yourself. Learning from a network of experienced people and seeing what they're doing would be the second step. The third step around ethical behavior, it's less around AI, more around data protection, is I don't think governments always, definitely this is true in corporates, understand the value of their data, or the bias of their data, the risk of their data, the accuracy of the data. The AI tools are exciting and interesting, particularly when you add um, quantum compute. But it's all based on the quality of your data. The powerful asset in all of this is the data. The better the data, the better the trained model. So it's very hard to understand the ethical implications of what you're doing unless you understand your data.
Mm,
What are its gaps? What is it strong at? Where's the data being sourced and under what conditions? Given what you're trying to solve and the people at the end of your AI tool that may be recipients of the services, who are they? And what relation do they have onto the original training set? So I sort of reflect only after a short 2 year period of time. I probably didn't think enough as I do now around the data.
mm, mm.
We focus very much on the tools, what could be achieved with the tools. The tools are amazing and they're developed at a large rate. The understanding of the data, I think, is the first step in ethical understanding, and how to put a management model around ethical considerations and unintended consequences. I'd start with data first. It also informs what type of AI tool might be appropriate for what you're trying to achieve, and what may be appropriate for government department A or company B may be suitable for them, but not suitable for you based on where your data is, where its starting point is, how it's been developed, and what problem you're trying to solve.
Mm,
So
mm.
I think the caution around the planning of any AI project, starting with understanding your data, is also the start of understanding your ethics
Yeah.
and how you might manage those.
And let me just ask, you mentioned data. Ellen actually had a question around this on a recent roundtable about mature AI at some organizations is now, getting into 10, 15, maybe even 20 years old in some cases.
Mm.
With those data sets that it relies on, it needs fundamentally, how do we ensure that AI is capable, where it is mature, of reflecting the latest trends that we're seeing in society? Because there are examples where AI is not indiscriminate. It's based on data sets that have been inputted by us, by teams, by humans, and there are cases
Mm.
where AI is, being very selective, and it is not, as I say, it's not indiscriminate in the way it's approaching people, its end users. How do we ensure, therefore, that AI does reflect the values of today? How do we ensure it doesn't reflect human bias, if we will?
Yeah, very good question, Alex. I see people are being split into two camps, including myself. Some people are very focused on the AI tool and the opportunities and moving with speed to seize those opportunities. Other people are much more in the data camp. What data are we using? What bias may we create? There are times there's a bit of friction between those two camps we start to see playing out. Both positions are equally as valid and important. The bias discussions that I'm seeing with the parties I've been involved with or asked to advise from time to time um, are often looking at the results of the early training of the AI model and then starting to consider the results are not as expected, and bias starts to come up. Um, but if we, repeating myself a little bit, if we have a better insight around the data and how it was developed, we can start to forecast those things better. So if I look at our overall maturity around managing risk and bias, myself included, we've had, I think, some good experience around early AI projects. And now that's started to raise questions around outcomes we didn't expect. So if we're looking at trying to predict what some of the purchasing behaviors of um, 15-year-old males might be
Mm,
out of a data set, and we're seeing unusual outcomes that don't quite marry up with our common sense views, we're then going back to the data. So I think our maturity and understanding is starting to progress, but it's progressing much slower than the pace of AI development. So I think there's a big risk here, and it's a big watch out flag. Which is, you may have some very good AI tools, you might have some really exciting results, But if you're not really sure about all of the circumstances you're applying to that tool, you will have some unexpected outcomes and consequences. Now, some of those might be quite negative. They might feed back information to customers in an automated way that is not desirable, or they might lead organizations to make decisions that are fundamentally just wrong in terms of decision support. So I think there's two sides to this question. One is the answers in terms of your starting position around bias are going to be found in the data. Once the better you know that, I think the role of data science is becoming much, much more prevalent than we had first anticipated on this journey at the start. The second is business leaders and business owners taking a really strong view around what are the result sets looking like. Are they expected? Do they know their markets? They know their business? You really need the two to join to then go, what have we created? What unintended outcomes are starting to occur, positive and negative, and why? And what ethical considerations do we now need to start thinking about? The reason I frame it like that is it's really easy to be utopian and say, look, before we do any project, we're going to spend a significant amount of time and design and review our ethics ad nauseum, and we're going to have lots of governance around this, and the magic ethics answer will come out of that process. I think that's entirely unrealistic. There are meaningful issues that need to be resolved, and if I look at ethics slightly differently, and come back to my breast cancer example, it is unethical not to use these tools to
Mm-hmm.
solve a compelling issue that's here now that has the lives of women at its heart.
Mm-hmm.
So, ethics is a very difficult, multi headed beast when we look at the opportunity of a very powerful tool for good and not good, and the fact that fundamentally we're all still learning. So our systems around how we approach it must be, I think, learning systems,
Mm-hmm. And
and
evolve.
knowing that we don't know it all, knowing we don't have all the answers, there are not the ethical frameworks there to set up. And if I can make a comment harking back right to the start of our discussion, I'm really buoyed that organizations like Microsoft, and I know in AWS as another example, are taking leadership roles in this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're the ideal organizations to do it. And they will be in strong positions to help inform and support their customers. And in so doing, that'll help inform and support the legislature and governments who will need to be at the back end of this experience around legislating and oversight.
Yeah, yeah.
Unreasonable to put them at the front end of it. That's not really their role, particularly given the pace of change that we're seeing here.
Mm-hmm. You just brought me on to that next point around the legislation and the regulation of AI, which can feed into this question of ethics that we're talking about here on the podcast. But do you foresee a time where perhaps there is a sort of universal code of conduct that companies might want to adhere to, or to be seen to adhere to, with regards to AI, in terms of transparency with their customers, transparency with competitors? Because, as you say, governments are involved in this process, but perhaps not far enough. And I wonder, if is there a sort of theoretical, hypothetical scenario where companies there's a sort of set code of conduct, for want of a better phrase, that companies adhere to and subscribe to, in terms of their use and application of AI?
Yeah, I think that's a great aspiration, and I'd love to see that move at great speed. Look, just to give you an indication how old I'm becoming, I did my MBA in the mid 2000s. And way back then, there was the concept in accounting terms of the triple bottom line, which looked at fiscal responsibility, people responsibility, environmental responsibility. Good Lord, what? Yeah, nearly 20 years later, that's really now starting to become a reality that's nearly globally accepted in terms of environmental protection,
Mhm.
predominantly driven by demands of the market and legislation and governments. But that's a long time, and AI will be a long time as well. I think we'll get to a point where there are typical norms. And if I use environmental norms as an example, it'll be market and stakeholder driven that will then drive legislation. We're not at that point of norms yet. We're not quite at the point of even defining very clearly AI. It's a ubiquitous term. It means different people, different things to different people, and we've got different organisations applying AI in very different ways to meet their own ends. So we're in the storming phase. And I think it's a storming phase. We just got to be a little bit careful. If I looked at what is the minimum international benchmark we should start to have in place, and I think it's around data protection, particularly public data sources. The assets of a population and a people. They are very valuable assets. They provide amazing insights in terms of personal behaviours, and something I would like to see as the first step is clearly defined uses around public data with very clear oversight around how governments and its use by private sector is to be applied. Private sources of data, very hard to do that with, but they're usually a little bit more disparate. They're in smaller pockets, and the assets of private companies or private individuals. Public data, usually much broader, much more sensitive, much deeper in its size. So I think as a first step, oversight around appropriate use and each country defining what that is
Mm,
and being flexible around that as AI changes, probably the first cab off the rank for me.
mm, mm.
You can do some amazing things with the use of that data. You could potentially do some amazing damage and create some unintended consequences if that's not used in the appropriate way.
Mm.
Once it's out, very hard to get it back.
No, thank you, Glenn. Well, look, I want to try something, a bit of a quick fire section, if I can do this, because I was reading this week on Forbes. They had top 10 predictions. They'd spoken to a range of experts, admittedly, but we have one here in yourself, and I wanted to put some of them to you and just get a sense of, if I can, a sort of yes or no, whether you agree with their predictions, see where we're going with AI. I'm conscious that this is our sort of 5 minute
Sure.
klaxon, so let's give it a go. I'll read them to you and you tell me what you think. So, first and foremost, top of their predictions was language AI is going to take center stage. Do you agree with that?
I agree.
You.
It's technically relatively simplistic to do, and there's already a lot of models in place, a lot of experience in place. So it'll take center stage for a short period of time.
Okay, that's a good start. Thank you very much. At least 3 climate AI startups, they say, will become unicorns. It's quite a specific number, but is that a statement you would subscribe to?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely the work at NASA, a very large chunk of their work is on earth science and climate change. So the shared data that's been available for a very long time that is made publicly available now lends itself very nicely for climate analysis and even targeted climate solutions. So yeah, I'd agree with that comment. I think that would be good fertile ground, and I think we'll see a number of organisations exploding in that space.
Mm, mm.
Quite where and how will be interesting to see where they land.
Yeah, absolutely. And this one's interesting as well. Toronto, they're saying, in Canada, will likely establish itself as the most important AI hub in the world outside of Silicon Valley and China. I'm guessing there must be a lot of investment going into Toronto in terms of its AI. Is that something you've seen in terms of your colleagues or contacts you have?
Yeah, hopefully there's one I can decline, but no, I absolutely agree. The Canadian government have been real stars in supporting AI technology development. The first publicly available quantum compute, D-Wave, came out of Canada. I don't know much about China and AI, I must admit, but there's strong strength, obviously, in the US and the corporate sector. But in terms of a centre for AI, Toronto and Canada really took an early leadership role in investing and supporting as a country and creating that capability.
Mm.
A number of organisations I'm involved in AI, probably 30% would be coming out of Canada at the moment.
Wow, wow. And finally, this one actually brings us back nicely, and I'm assuming you're going to agree with it based on our conversation. But responsible AI, that term, will begin to shift from a vague catch all to an actual operationalized set of enterprise practices, which more or less goes in line with what we've been saying so far. So I'm assuming it's an agreement with that statement.
Funnily enough, not quite. I think, that is true for commoditized AI. So AI services you can subscribe to, you can pick up from Microsoft or AWS or um, a number of other vendors that will start to rear their head, and there's a few around now. But I think with AI, one of the opportunities it presents, I mentioned earlier, you can solve problems you could never solve before. And I think we'll see uh, imagination, innovation, and invention occurring much more. So I think we've got the commoditized AI space and we've got the inventive AI space. And I think the inventive AI space will grow significantly and continue to grow, and we'll see the commoditized AI space just track behind it as what is a new invention starts to become commoditized.
Mm,
So I partly agree, but I sort of disagree. I think we've got a very brave invention time solving some pretty amazing problems. And I think with a technology like AI, that's not a period that will end. I
mm.
think it's just the inherent nature of what this tool will do and further development on itself.
Yeah, well, you were determined to disagree with at least one of those predictions, so you've part achieved that. So thanks for Glenn for doing that, and just round us off really with this sort of quick fire section because I am conscious of time that we have together here on the pod. But this is perhaps a tricky one. What worries you about AI? What keeps you up at night with regards where we're going with all of this?
Yeah, yeah. I think there are some amazing things, and we'll see lots of really good news stories around what people are doing. And I'm I'm always amazed with what I see, what others are doing, and their imagination, and how they're really achieving some giant leaps. The thing that really scares me is how you can apply these tools for malicious intent. They're incredibly powerful tools. Um, my experience around solving cybersecurity problems when I was in the health sector or other government departments. These are tools that can cause chaos and havoc. And I think if you're a custodian of large data sets, the more focus you can spend on data protection, the better. So just as we have great opportunities around new problems to solve, equally we have great risks in the hands of malicious actors. It's very easy to get these tools; they're very cheap, and particularly around the cyber protection space, I'm always amazed how inventive bad actors are,
Mm.
and that's my sole worry.
No, I think that's well, it's well substantiated. I think and a very fair thing to suggest with regards worry. I've heard that before in terms of where we're going with it and how it can be used. You say maliciously, that is something to consider. But Glenn, thank you so much for being part of the podcast. It's been a privilege and a pleasure having this conversation with you. As they're giving up your evening all the way from New Zealand to join us here in the UK on this format. So thank you for doing that. We normally close out strategy for breakfast with some sort of joke. So let me just put this ball in your court. Have you ever heard a joke about AI? Because it's okay to say no to that, but is there such a thing as a joke about AI?
Actually, I haven't, so I hope you've got one, Alex.
Well, I do, but I'm partly shifting this over to the research that I did, and actually, AI of all the things that I could thought it would be used for has actually been used in the world of comedy, among other things, because people are actually trying to get. Robots to tell jokes, to understand humor, which as an emotion, as a social construct, is near impossible, it seems, based on the jokes I can share with you now, because some of these are, well, make up your own minds. Let me just first credit where they came from. These were created by an algorithm research scientist and author, Janelle Shane, using a data set of more than 43,000 jokes and one-liners. And these are just a couple of the results. So you can be the judge. First one, what do you call a pastor that crosses the road? He
Don't know.
he takes the chicken. I think it's misunderstood somewhere, and you can see where these are going. It's almost there, but it's not quite.
Yeah,
What do you
yeah,
get
not
when you
quite.
cross a cow with a rhino? A bungee with a dog. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. I've no idea what any of those mean. But I just want to reiterate a big thanks for coming on the podcast, for humouring us, for sharing your information, sharing your knowledge, I should say, about all
No,
things.
pleasure. Thanks, Alex. I'd probably just leave one parting comment. Now, we often talk about artificial intelligence, an exciting word. I still much prefer a more practical word, which is instead of AI, IA, which is intelligent assistant. And
Mm,
I think that's really where we are.
mm,
We'll get to self-learning, self-directed AI, but much prefer to set our sights on IA
yeah.
in the intelligent assistant space and keep the people in the mix.
And I've heard that said as well about this resistance to the term AI in its purest form. Augmented intelligence. Actually, I've heard people say they prefer to think of
Mm.
it as opposed to artificial. So, no, thank you, as I say, for coming on. If you have enjoyed this, our listeners, you can join us at the next GDS Digital Innovation Virtual Summit. That's happening in July later this month. Go to gdsgroup.com/events for more details. And of course, don't forget, subscribe, share, let us know what you think of the Strategy for Breakfast podcast. We want every episode to be as interesting and entertaining as we can make it. And hopefully, we'll come back with some better jokes for next week. But get in touch via the comments or emails, podcast@gdsgroup.com. But that is it from us. Thank you very much for listening. Bye bye.